A question was heard about the hero's well-being. Seeing the doctor, he thought that he heard this question every day. The guy lowered his head and said that his legs hurt? This answer was every day. The doctor looked at him and said that he understood, said that he could increase the dose of drugs and called Kim. At that moment Seung Ssi thought that he no longer cared about the answer to the question when everything went wrong. The nurse came up to him and said with a smile that she would take him to the room. The protagonist looked straight ahead with an empty look and thought that when he came to, everything was over. The wheelchair was held by the handles. The paralyzed man looked around and seeing people thought that the only thing he was left with were looks filled with pity and monthly insurance payments. With his hands down, sitting in a chair, he thought that he was left only with the cruel reality of being half paralyzed. There was no sadness, no joy, no melancholy in his face, it was empty. As he rolled down the hallway, he thought about how it was an accident and an accident caused by drunk driving. The guy remembered himself in a tracksuit and thought about how that day was painfully ordinary and how he usually stopped at the grocery store. He had a bag on his arm and he thought about buying beer and snacks to properly spend the end of the day. A light flashed near him, which made him turn around, and this was the only thing that distinguished that day from the others. When the hero turned around, a car was already flying at full speed towards him. He looked at it in horror and thought about how unlucky he was. Shoes and drinks flew to the side. While the nurse lifted him to put him on the bed, he thought about how his life had come to an end with terrible pain. Air bubbles slowly entered the four bag and Seung Ssi thought about how he was left with phantom pain in his legs as if they had been amputated. Taking the pills in his trembling hands, he thought about how he had no choice but to rely on the pills every night. Clenching his hand into a fist, the guy shook and thought about how they say that God gives him as many trials as he can withstand, but it is better to die. Another night came and the hospital windows were brightly lit. The guy picked up his phone. Looking at the screen with a saddened look, he thought about how with a half-paralyzed body, there was little that was left in his power and all he could do was read novels. Looking at the smartphone screen at the announcement of 50 chapters, the protagonist thought about the novel he started reading last week. As he flipped through the chapters, he thought that when he reads works with a happy ending, he also feels happy, and reading them is an extremely calming activity when he feels depressed like today. A small light from the phone screen finally appeared in his eyes, but he still remained meaningfully silent and thought that he was almost finished with the novel. Running his finger over the phone, the paralyzed man said that in theory he would finish today. In this novel, an old magician named Aiden appeared before him, destroyed everything in his path and, having finally won, chose to create a new world. Afterwards, a knight appeared before him and he continued, thinking that he finished the old world and recreated the world according to his tastes. Everyone lost their memories and lived a happy life, even those who had experienced the traumatic experience of the deaths of those they cherished most. That magician stood on the top of the mountain and now everyone lived like happy winners. Looking at the last words and the thanks for reading, the hero wondered why. His hand was shaking and he thought about how the main character went through all this to protect the world and in the end he just decides to cross it all out by destroying the world. His hands were shaking more and more and the paralyzed one mentioned that he was creating the world only for himself. The phone screen was shining brightly and he wondered why even a random novel had to have a bad ending. He pressed the phone to his forehead and, bursting into tears, wondered why he couldn't just be happy like Guts. The guy lowered his head and thought about how he didn't really care about the endings of novels and even if he woke up tomorrow, the protagonist lay down on the bed and thought about how a good ending would never be something achievable for him. But then drops of bright light began to fall into the room, illuminating the surroundings. A bright light lit up. A notification came out about the beginning of the magician who dominates the world and then he opened his eyes already in a new body. The bastard jumped up from the bed in horror and thought about what was happening. Grabbing the blanket, he thought that it seemed to him that he had just seen some kind of notification in front of his eyes and wondered what it was. Looking at his feet, the reincarnated thought that he had started hallucinating. But then, looking around the room, he realized that something was wrong here. The environment was completely different and he wondered where he was. The dark-haired one looked around and thought that he had fallen asleep in the hospital, asked if he was still asleep and began to look for a phone. But there was only a bucket of water nearby. The guy looked at the reflection in the water and saw his new self. The hero grabbed it and wondered what was wrong with his face. Suddenly, understanding overtook him. He began to slowly lower his legs and thought that something unthinkable had just happened. But then the system appeared again. The protagonist immediately looked at it questioningly. A notification popped up in front of him again, but this time it was static. The green-eyed man looked at it in surprise and wondered what it was. Seeing the inscription about the task, he thought that he already knew this story. Ward looked at it with anxiety and thought that this was the name of the novel he was reading. Seeing a sign that said that if the character dies, then he will die, and the hero thought that this person is a secondary character and wondered what was happening. But then he decided to get up on his feet with anxiety. His eyes opened wide and thought about what if this is real. He raised his hands with anxiety and thought that this is impossible. His legs were completely healthy and the protagonist thought that before he did not even feel them, but now he is standing. The new body gave him the confidence that he lacked so much. Looking down, Ward thought that he could feel the wooden floor under his feet and very clearly, but suddenly the information began to download. The green-eyed man was scared. A large load came into his head from reading memories. The language of this world and all the contents of the novel were registered in it. He grabbed his head when many fragments from the memory of this body began to emerge, and he thought that he could feel all the memories. In front of him appeared a small boy pinned to the wall, and the hero thought that he could see what kind of life he lived. Then a bloody hand appeared in front of him and he thought that he could see how it broke off. Seeing a respectable man, information came out with his name and that he is the son of the bizarre 7 archdukes. Then a picture appeared of an old man looking at a baby, and the explanation said that he was the illegitimate son of the patriarch of the family and someone so powerful. When the adult version of the baby appeared, it was said that even if all the protagonists united against him, it still did not guarantee their victory. But then a memory surfaced of Mord being hung up in chains and sealed and in the middle of a magic ritual to gain complete control over his soul. He was ambushed and killed by the protagonists and his group, and in short, he is a minor character, after which the hero wondered why he became him. Suddenly, a notice appeared in front of him demanding that he change the fate of destruction and then his wish will be fulfilled. The green-eyed man frowned and looked at it and asked again. He looked at the notice again and thought that his wish would be fulfilled. He again imagined the powerful mage and thought that the fate of destruction meant the ending of the novel. Taking his hand away, Mord thought about how it wanted him to protect the world and instead of the protagonist who would later destroy it, imagining his past body. Singh SSI thought about how he needed to reflect and thought about how he was just having a beautiful dream. Then he imagined his new body and thought about how it was because he was tired of his life. The dark-haired man remembered his terrible despair and thought about how he couldn't repeat the daily life of a half-paralyzed person, and if this was a dream, he didn't want to wake up. The bastard raised his hand and thought about how he didn't care if this was a prank from God or something like that, and there had to be a desire. Clenching his fist, the guy thought that his wish was simple and he wanted to return his body which was before the accident, but then he gave up on it because you can't be content with just this. Imagining a thunderstorm, the hero thought about changing the fate of destruction to fulfill wishes. He imagined an old man and the local main villain and thought about collecting all the information about the novel. Imagining the cultists in the future, the warrior thought about collecting information about all the skills and strength and changing fate. The guy was filled with confidence and thought that it was worth trying, but then he gave up the idea, smiling, thinking that he would do it. Mord was part of the Archduke family and was an illegitimate child. His life was hard and he also had no idea who his mother was. Then he imagined a child next to a woman and thought that his mother died a couple of days after she gave him life. The little boy huddled in the corner near the barrel and was called the bastard who killed his mother, and he lived the life of a weakling, unable to respond to the attacks from others. The green-eyed man sat with a devastated look, listening to the insults. It was not because he was weak or because he did not know how to be angry, but because the guilt of being a bastard was eating him up from the inside. The hero imagined a man filled with aura and thought about how the powers of those of his line awaken when they turn 15, and they call it the awakening of new blood. Imagining a man surrounded by a red aura, he thought about how he must overcome pain comparable to if his entire body was burning. The man was in agony and he thought about how after this, he would be gifted with great power. The chosen one was being torn apart, and for someone outside the Archduke's family, the chances of surviving the awakening of new blood are less than 1 in 5. The same man was torn to pieces with blood splashes, but as it turned out, Maud was able to survive this. He was filled with power and gained great power. On the table lay a letter that said that if he survives his 15th birthday, then he must go to the family of the Archduke. The protagonist imagined that same head of the castle and thought that the character listened to his mother's last letter and went to where the family is located and agreed to undergo the test in exchange for recognition from his father, whom he had never seen before. The green-eyed man scratched the back of his head and thought that according to these memories, he had just arrived at the family's residence to undergo the test. But Maud is a secondary character, but the family is not one of the main antagonists, and he has a lot of information about the family. He imagined many warriors and thought that the Archduke already had many blood children, so it was unlikely that he would be accepted due to him being illegitimate. But suddenly the white-haired man was filled with determination, and having grown up without parents, he was full of desire to be recognized as a son, and the old man used this to raise his hound. Suddenly the big man opened one eye, emitting an aura and awakening the powers of the new blood, became so strong that even the protagonist had trouble fighting him, but he was not sure how strong he really was. Maud clenched his fist and thought with a slight smile that it would be nice to find out, but then he was forced to turn around by being called out. At the door stood a man who asked if he had forgotten what day it was, and at that moment the reincarnated man thought that this man was in his memories. The warrior looked at him with a menacing look and, putting his hands on his hips, asked what was staring at him, and he thought that this was the instructor who would oversee the test and was well built as befits such a person. The guy came closer and, having clarified his name, asked what was the matter and thought that, nevertheless, he was bigger than him. Todd lowered his head with a menacing look and thought that the tone had changed greatly. Having examined the new protege, he thought that his eyes also looked different and thought that he had simply gotten fixated. The man put his hands on his belt and asked if he had forgotten what had been explained to him and said that he had already said that there would be a test today, after which Maud happily clarified. The instructor calmly said that this test was to see his potential because he was well built for someone who could not do anything, and asked about his fighting skills. But then the green-eyed man turned pale and looked down, thinking that he would have to rush into battle right away. Clenching his fist, he thought that at least this was not a fight for life, and in any case, he was happy. The reincarnated man looked up with alarm and thought that he was going to test his skills one way or another. They walked through the forest. Along the way, Todd, without turning around, asked him if he remembered what he had said yesterday. But suddenly the hero looked at him in surprise and asked again, which angered the interlocutor. The instructor turned around with a menacing look and said not to mention that he was the son of the Archduke. The protagonist continued to follow him and thought that he was being told about the unspoken rule of bastards, but this made no sense, since rumors had already spread when he got here, and rumors were going around that the leader had already met with his son and everyone would find out who the bastard was as soon as he became an official warrior. The guys were happy to see the instructor, and he greeted them. But the reincarnated one looked at them with concern and said nothing meaningfully. One of the guys looked at him with a smile and asked if it was true that this was the new guy who would be taking the test, and the hero immediately thought that they looked a bit old for training and were most likely warriors. Todd came closer to him and said that he assumed that he had already heard that the way of Werner fights is different from how an ordinary warrior fights. To which the green-eyed one said with a serious look that he uses weapons without being trained, but once they undergo training, weapons are no longer needed. The protagonist said with a calm look that they will fight with the body they have. To which the instructor said with a menacing look that this is true, and those who are not of their family's blood use weapons, but the rest study martial arts. The hero looked down and thought that he knows this. Presenting the family crest, he thought about how it was known for its military organization, the best on the continent, and they had earned this position only thanks to hand-to-hand combat and did not need weapons. The protagonist, with a slightly worried look, said that it sounded incredible, but in this world there was no weapon that could overcome the physical capabilities of their clan. But then the man turned to Vince and said that this test would decide where he would go to train and most importantly how. The blonde entered the battlefield and said that he was ready. He looked at his opponent with a pompous smile while the order for the hero to fight was heard. He in turn, was absolutely calm, and Todd continued, talking about the need to prove that he was part of the bloodline. The warrior put his hand on his hip and thought. He scratched the back of his head and asked if they were sure that he was 15, and although his face looked like that, there were doubts. The impudent man beckoned him with his finger and said that considering how big he was really interested in whose son he was and was going to see if his fighting skills were up to par. The green-eyed man looked away, exhaling and thinking that there would be another bastard here and more than one archduke was good at scams and now he needed to focus on the test. He stood in a stance and thought that with the help of strength alone, one could gain freedom, and strength was very important in this world, but it would be great if he could live carefree and quietly somewhere far away. The guy sat down lower for a more solid stance and thought that he had a choice. An aura began to emanate from him and he thought that he would prove his skills here. The hero jumped up, raising his fist to strike. The blonde was scared after that. With difficulty, he was able to dodge the uppercut. Parents looked at him with concern and thought that he shouldn't know how to fight, but in reality, it was not so. The protagonist raised his leg and thought that he was more agile than expected, and it seemed that boxing lessons in his younger days had not been in vain. He hit the block with all his might and thought that even though he did it as a hobby, it was better than nothing. The soldier stayed on his feet and slowed down. He raised his head menacingly and said that he was not bad. The blonde got up from his knees and said that he was lying, saying that he was not trained. The hero angered him, saying that he did not understand what they were talking about and asked why he would lie, and then the opponent with extreme displeasure said that he had the stance of a trained fighter. The green-eyed man sank a little lower and said that he copied others, but then the soldier got really angry and kept silent meaningfully. He jumped up from his place, loading his fist with mana. The narrow-eyed soldier anxiously leaned forward, surprised by this, and asked to stop, because this was a child who had not even learned the combat mana technique, but the instructor said that he allowed it. The big guy called out to him, but the teacher said that he would leave it that way. He became more serious and fell silent. The hero, looking at the enemy, realized that mana would be used against him. The blonde looked at him menacingly and asked if they were making fun of him. He charged a blow with a crazy smile and said that he was giving in a little, so he should be grateful, but suddenly his blow missed due to dodging. The protagonist impudently looked at him, while he did not understand how this could happen because he was kind of a beginner, when suddenly Maud said with a menacing look that the time had come. He pulled his hand back and clenched his fist, while the military man turned around and thought about how he had pulled off the combat mana technique so easily. The green-eyed man came close, charging the same blow and asked if it was his turn. Starting to move, his eyes became empty and he thought that this was incredible. The veteran covered himself with his hands in horror and thought that he had spent years studying the technique of combat mana to lose to this newbie. The blow that landed on his body echoed throughout the entire area. The blonde was defeated and screamed loudly. A gust of wind and the force of the blow threw him far back. Everyone was in complete shock and froze. The instructor looked at his back and thought that it was the newbie who sent the official warrior flying. The hero's back seemed simply enormous and he continued his thought thinking about what kind of incredible guy he was. The hero stopped, raising his leg. His opponent lay with his back to the stone wall. The protagonist with a belt tied around his waist looked at him. Looking at this, he thought that things would have been bad if he hadn't dodged the last attack, but it seemed to have become clear how to use this power. But suddenly the defeated one began to move. The green-eyed man stood up again and asked if he could get up after that and said that he thought that warriors were just on a different level. But suddenly something struck him. The blonde was drooling and thinking that this scoundrel was different. The bald warrior looked at this with alarm and wondered how he was defeated with just one blow, and the second one wondered where this bastard came from. But then the hero turned around and asked if it would be worthwhile to stop because he had no idea how to control his power and therefore he could finish him off if they continued like this. The teacher looked at him menacingly and remained silent. He continued to stare and thought about the fact that he was a test subject and he was an instructor and his task was to test the strength of the test subject by bringing him to the limit of strength, and there was no way that he would defeat him. The brown-eyed man became even more serious. But suddenly, while the wounded man was being carried off the site, he ordered to stop. The bearded man took his hand away and asked why he had lied, and he asked again. Todd frowned and said that he had never learned to fight. The green-eyed man scratched his cheek and said that it was true and that he had never learned. The instructor came closer and asked if he wanted him to believe it after using mana, and asked how a person who had not been trained in the technique of combat mana could know how to use it, after which the hero thought that he doubted him as expected. He began to surround his hand with a stream and asked if it was mana, saying that he was able to use it once after a bad cold, but he was not so knowledgeable about it and thought that he should not tell him everything. The mentor, still with the same monkey face, asked if he thought he would believe it, and then the interlocutor began to tell a story. The protagonist told about the experience of awakening new blood. Maud could use mana before awakening and he was so talented. The god of battles Verneras stood with his hands folded and the goddess of battles Erita folded her hands to create a sphere. The blood of two gods coexisted in the body of the young talent, creating incredible synergy, and the guy is truly a terrifying creature. Light appeared and he was blessed with his genetics. The character stood like a rock surrounded by mana and like someone who did not undergo official training until his 15th birthday. The blonde man was radiating energy, and as it turned out, he had achieved a lot in just 7 years. He looked menacingly ahead, gritting his teeth. The man stood on a mountain of bodies, holding the boy by the head, and he surpassed the Archduke himself in strength, who was the strongest heir to the god of battles, and that is how history went. The instructor scratched his head after hearing the story and said that if what he told was true, then it says a lot. He looked away and asked if he knew who Vince was, to which he was told in response that this was the first meeting. Then Todd introduced him, saying that he was a warrior who had trained since childhood and had passed a severe test, and the hero himself had already grabbed the back of his head when he was told that he had defeated such a monster. But suddenly the instructor noticed something strange and meaningfully remained silent. He exhaled sharply and said that one way or another he passed the test, scoring 200 points with a minimum of 100, and asked what he was going to do, to which the hero thought that he actually couldn't understand what he should do, because nothing was explained. The green-eyed man straightened up and said that he didn't really understand what this test meant, to which he was told that this test determined the level he was currently at. He took his hand away and said that the family had a 3-level training system. To begin with, he imagined an ordinary fighter and said that if he met the requirements at each level, he would advance to the next. A picture of a sword fight also appeared before his eyes. Todd imagined pumped-up men fighting and said that if he passed the test at the last level, then he would be recognized as an official warrior. But then he lowered his head and said that the difficulty of the test was high, and many simply hit their ceiling. The green-eyed man raised his hand to his chin and said that he understood. Then he stunned the man by telling him to send him to the first level. The hero lowered his head and asked if he should go there to learn the basics of the combat mana technique, and then asked if he would be taught it at the second or third level. And Maud pulled his hand away when he was told that this was not the case, and then asked if he would advance anyway if he met the requirements. And he was immediately even more surprised, thinking that it would be more logical if he wanted to pass the test to immediately become an official warrior. The protagonist proudly raised his head and said that then he would still go to the first level. The instructor again looked at him menacingly and thought that this guy was serious and in any case a bastard. He turned away and thought that it could be for the best and said that he agreed and he would not have provided him with preferential treatment in any case. As he left, the man, still looking menacing, said that this was all he had to do today and that tomorrow he would send him to someone to be taught everything necessary at level 1. Maud lay down on the bed with his hand behind his head and thought about how the test had gone smoothly. He imagined the owner of this body and wondered if he had gone through the same process, since the novel did not tell how he became the hidden ace in the sleeve of the Archduke. The guy leaned forward and thought that he believed that this made sense since he was a secondary character. The green-eyed man put his hand to his chin and thought about how it only said that the leader tried to bring the potential son to the maximum and dominate his mind in order to turn him into a human weapon, and wondered how he had passed the test. Looking around the room with concern, he thought about how as a child he always suffered beatings and wondered what if he was simply beaten and sent to the first level, and there was a feeling that this would have happened. The protagonist still doubted and thought that he understood the reason for moving into this body. Remembering himself in real life, he thought that it was not that it was an auxiliary feature, but he always fought when he felt that something was unfair or unjust. The green-eyed man became sad and meaningfully remained silent. Looking out of bed, the guy dropped his hands and thought that Mord lived a life opposite to his past. The beast from the house opened with a creak. The reincarnated one left the house and thought about what would save this world from destruction, and in order to do this he needed to defeat the protagonist of the novel, Aiden. He imagined many fragments and thought that the one who collects the fragments of the world, which like puzzles contain pieces of the world, can be called the supreme god and is the magician who dominates the world. Imagining the crystal, the hero thought that it was just like the title says, that the sorcerer collected the fragments and became a being ruling over the entire world and everything connected to it. In his imagination, the wizard held a huge sphere standing on top of a mountain, and the result was the destruction of the world. He imagined a battle of enormous proportions and thought that he, having become a god, killed not only his enemies, but also his comrades, and the novella narrated the battle between the magician and his enemies to become the destroyer of the world. The sun was already setting behind the horizon. The green-eyed man looked straight ahead, full of determination, calling the hero of that novel. He clenched his fist with all his might and thought that he would make sure that he did not do this. Imagining many lights, the guy thought that this could be his last chance. The reincarnated one seemed to have left his past and thought that therefore he would now live like the man from the novella. If you dive into history, the Archduke Werner's family is the ruler of the lands called Werner's Possession, and their castle is located in the heart of the state, was as luxurious as the royal castles of other states. And at the same time there were training bases for warriors. They were on the outskirts of the castle, in the outer castle of the third region. Then a chariot appeared and shouted that today they will live in the first level dormitory and the main path is close to the training base. At that moment, the young man turned away and thought that it felt like the training base was larger than any campus in the university. He thought, this should be expected from the Werner's family. Suddenly, something distracted him. Then a comrade turned to him and said that this was most likely the training fields of the third level. In response he heard, did this sound really come from the training groups? Then the young man looked out the window and thought that even if this was a second level training, they would surpass human limits in the blink of an eye, because now they were on their way to becoming Werner's warriors. And then he imagined these people and thought that, besides, it was said that warriors were capable of carrying the strength of several people at once. And when the carriage arrived, they said that they would soon arrive at the third region of the castle. Their instructor would be waiting for them there. Finally, the guy got out of the carriage and thanked him, then turned around and heard that another big guy had appeared on the first level. An adult man approached him and said that he was an instructor at the first levels of Haze, a newbie could call him that. The guy approached him and said that he understood everything, then he heard that it must be that he failed the test since despite his physical form he ended up here. The protagonist replied that he defeated the opponent in the test. He was surprised and asked if he really could defeat an official warrior. Then he bowed his head and asked if this was true, then why was this man here? And the young man came closer and said that there was no point in lag, the truth would still be revealed. So he added that he had never studied the technique of combat mana or any other martial art, came here to learn the basics. The instructor looked at him and said that in this case they could follow him and thought, could it really be that this guy defeated Vince without any training? Finally, they entered the barracks and the man said that the people here were in the process of training, so there was no need to distract them. And Maud followed and thought that maybe this was the first level, but they must be very strong, training for the position of warriors. Finally, they took him inside and said that this was a newbie. All the guys looked there in surprise. The instructor came closer and said that this man was a new trainee, so there was no need to pay attention and continue training, and the guy thought that all the other students were children. Then he tensed up and thought maybe he should go to the third level, if only he could change his mind, everything would have turned out differently. But then the man turned around and asked if he understood correctly that he had never learned the technique of combat mana, and in response he heard that no, but he had mana. After which the brunette came closer and said that since the student had gone through the awakening of new blood, this could be called a gift, since he possessed mana. What he would teach him would be easy. Then he raised his hand and said that firstly, he needed to find ether and create mana, but he had already done this. Secondly, he needed to collect it. But he believed that the young man had already done this, and the last step was the basis for controlling mana and feeling the strengthening, then he would be able to advance to the second level. Maud was surprised at first and asked if he should learn any combat techniques, and the instructor raised his head and asked if he really wanted to stay here for a long time. If he wanted, he could arrange it. But the guy was a little confused and said that he didn't mean that at all. In response he heard that the teacher already knew what he was thinking. Then the man exhaled and said that he would teach him a couple of things. After that he would be able to train on his own. The instructor of the next level would fix everything if everything was bad. The main character stood opposite and thought that this was true. Since he had not learned anything, he should start from the basics. It was better not to underestimate this. Just because this was the first level, he needed a good foundation to use his power and thank the teacher. Some time passed, everyone stood aside and discussed that only 10 minutes had passed since the beginning of this guy's training, and what was happening was unthinkable. They looked at his energy and said what they thought, his mana is stronger than that of the instructor. And indeed, everything around was enveloped in the energy of this man. He raised his head and asked, is it really all over? Is the teacher really not joking? Then he came closer and said that in fact Mort had already passed the first level. The main character could not believe it was really all over, and then he heard that from tomorrow he could move on to the second level. So time passed. The physical reinforcement lessons at the second level were divided into two sub-levels. The first was strengthening the body. This is necessary in order to prevent any damage, which the guy did. The next stage was strengthening physical capabilities so that he could surpass all his limits. The young man also tried hard on them. He trained and thought about the fact that he needed to surpass the limits that would be achieved when training his muscles. If you think about it deeper, physical reinforcement is a very difficult skill. Many trainees hit the ceiling, but it took him less than half an hour to master it, and everyone was watching. Then the main character turned around and said what he thought. He only had a training duel left, and the instructor at that moment was thinking what the hell was going on. This man was clearly stronger than the second level, after which he scratched his head and said that there was no need, allowing him to move on to the third level from tomorrow. You can go there. If you imagine these students, up to the second level, an easy day, but from the third should be more difficult. There will be people like him waiting for him, those who are part of the bloodline, so passing the third level will be quite a challenge. So the instructor folded his hands and said that the student will have to fight them without any fighting skills. The young man listened to all this and thought that now that he thought about it, he realized that he really did not learn any martial arts. The teacher sent him to the second level. He thinks that he is hiding his strength. And the man then came to him and said that in order to get to the second level, his brute strength is enough, but to become a warrior at the third level is not easy. He needs to work even harder. Then the guy lowered his head and thought, well, he knows that the third level will be different. He is so excited about meeting people gifted with the power of new blood that he can't wait to live until tomorrow. Finally, the next day came. The third level students were standing together and discussing what they heard, that someone had passed the second level in less than 2 days, but he was probably also part of the crown line. and another asked why someone of Werner's blood would go to the first level. And there were two more standing nearby, discussing what Fian would do next. He answered that such people are predictable, probably this person went there to attract the attention of the Duke. Then he frowned and added that he would show him that there are ragas within blood kinship. When the main character entered the room, everyone began to discuss that this was probably the same person, and he said that it was worth coming straight to this level, skipping the first two. When Fian approached him and asked if he understood correctly that this was a newcomer, he immediately asked who it was. The guy came closer and answered that he was a second-class captain, Fian, and immediately thought, is this really the same person, from the Werner's kinship? Then he smiled and said that he was related to the Duke, just like this guy, and the main character introduced himself and said that he was supposed to be part of the second class, although he didn't know how long ago. For some reason, after that, Fian got angry and asked if this place was really a joke for him, and the brown-haired guy scratched his head and said that he was wrong, he wouldn't have come all the way here if he perceived it that way. Then he turned around and said that he was in a bad mood right now, so he better calm down, but he continued to be angry. And then the guy looked him in the eyes and asked did he really think that he would piss his pants or something like that if he tried to intimidate him with such a stupid skill. It seems that these words made his opponent even more angry. Then he clenched his fist when Mort asked did he really think that the whole world was beneath him, just because he had gone through the awakening of the first blood, but he really thought that the only Vernars was here. His eyes literally blazed with anger when the young man said that he would kill him right here and now. Their comrades were watching all this, discussing that this poor newbie would not last long, because no one could stop Fian, and the other said that it would not be easy for him to survive if the instructor did not come now. Meanwhile, the main character was still listening to how his new opponent would not hold back since he was a relative of Vernar's, after which the red-haired man extended his hand and tried to grab him. Then he frowned and said that the young man would pay for his chatter, and then there was some kind of bang, even dust rose into the sky. The other guys covered their faces with their hands and thought that it was just some incredible power, poor unfortunate newcomer, they hoped that he would at least survive. Finally, two silhouettes appeared in the distance, but everyone there was in shock from what they saw, because it was not the main character lying on the ground. It turns out that Mort knocked the enemy to the ground and asked if he was really that weak, adding that he wanted to see so much, but how strong he would be. Then he looked at him and said that it turns out that Fian is no stronger than the village bully. He got up, wiped the blood, then he turned around and called him a bastard, said that he was just lucky with this blow, but the main character looked at him and replied that it was not luck, just that his opponent was weak. This news made the young man even more angry and immediately ran at him. However, when he struck another blow, the opponent returned again, and in addition, he tripped him, after which he struck another blow. Fian did not have time to correct anything, as he flew forward, and in addition to everything, he received a slap on the back of the head. The blow was so strong that even dust rose around. The guy then stepped back and thought what the hell happened. Then he looked at his opponent lying on the ground and thought that he was too weak. He thought that Vernars at level 3 would be strong enough. Then he looked at his hand and thought if this was because of the combat mana technique that he learned at level 2, if not, then the original player must have instinctively learned the basics of the combat mana technique. He thinks this means that the current one is weaker than the one in the novel. Then his friend ran up to his opponent and asked if everything was okay, said that he needed to pull himself together, and he stood up and told him to step back, because it was not over yet. The opponent looked at him and said that he had passed out, had been out of it for at least 10 seconds, and the guy continued to get angry and shouted that he had just managed to land a blow when he lost his vigilance. The protagonist then lowered his eyes and said that the guy lost his vigilance during a fight with someone who wanted to become a warrior, it was too humiliating. But the opponent was not going to give up and said that just because he could, did not mean that he should say everything that harmed him in his head. And then he got very angry, his anger was felt by everyone present, they said that now he was definitely awakening his power, someone should call the instructor, they needed to stop him. And they shouted at the newcomer to run, because he really could finish him off. The brown-haired man asked in surprise if this was true and thought that the guy must be calling on the powers of new blood. Then he looked at him and thought that he doesn't really control it, more like mana, but it makes sense if there are more bastards at this level. Suddenly someone appeared there and asked what was going on, it was an old man, to whom the guy answered that the new kid and the student started a fight, the instructor got really angry. Then he turned around and when asked if they shouldn't stop them, he said that he wanted to see what was going on. Then he turned around and thought that this man was strong enough to deal with an ordinary warrior, there weren't many chances to check how strong he really was, but this was one of them. Then he looked at the newbie and thought that it must be that Werner's brat who started today, the death of one bastard doesn't entail serious problems. At that moment, Finn had already accumulated enough energy, then he took a step forward and said that his opponent would pay with his life for pissing him off, and the young man stood opposite and thought that this bastard could use it too. After which he saw how the opponent jumped right above him and thought that this is an advanced skill that uses the body and weapon as a carrier to create a more powerful form of energy. Then he took a step back and realized that it was the impulse of the body. He managed to dodge the blow and jump back in time, and then energy began to gather around the student. The protagonist looked at all this and thought that it would be bad if he hit him with a blow. Finn jumped up and shouted that he dare not run away, after which he ran towards him. Then he pulled out his fist in a different way to concentrate energy in it, but then he got a fist in the face and at first did not understand what was happening. He looked at his opponent and mentally humiliated him, then he began to hit, but surprisingly the brown-haired man blocked all these blows very well and the guy thought only about how this was possible, his attacks do not work. At the same time, the main character's attacks were all successful and the guy received blows to the face just like that. He thought that he would not stand up to the bastard, who did not even use the power of new blood. The other students were standing nearby and discussing how no hits got through to him, but it looked like the new ones weren't getting through either because Finn looked untouched. The instructor was standing nearby, thinking that one hit definitely got through. Then he looked at the student and thought that it could be told by his decreasing momentum. Then he continued to watch the battle and thought, okay, he needs to be more serious this time. Then the main character decided to strike again. It was a hit right in the stomach. His opponent exhaled from the pain. Then he landed on the ground and heard from his opponent that he was trying to hold back, but it looked like it was still painful. After which Finn stood up and told him to shut up. All this man could do was run away with his tail between his legs, and he thought that if he struck one more blow, everything would be over. However, the young man stood opposite and listened to him say that he was finished. If he struck just one blow, he was sure that he was running because he understood it perfectly well. Then the main character smiled slyly and said that he would stop dodging then, he was going to go easy on him, but he couldn't stop irritating him. Finally, his opponent was happy and thought that he had fallen for it. Then he ran forward and shouted that it would be better not to regret it later. He aimed his fist straight at the newbie's chest, and when he reached the target, there was literally an explosion. It turned out that at the last moment, the guy managed to catch his fist. Then he raised his head and said that it looked like momentum doesn't really help if you're just weaker than your opponent. Then he swung and said that it was a good lesson, and Fine was scared at that moment and thought that for someone with momentum, it's normal to always win against those who don't have it, but this guy is amazing. And he immediately saw a fist flying straight towards him, after which the main character hit him in the stomach with all his might, and the opponent thought that he seemed to have started a fight that he would never win. He was in great pain from that blow, and the force was such that dust began to rise around him. The guy was literally thrown back a few meters from there, and thus he crashed his back into the wall. Then he lowered his head and lost consciousness, and the teacher looked at this and thought that it was unclear where this monster boy came from, and a legitimate child like him defeated such an opponent without even using momentum. He also thought that he had trained a huge number of Vernars before, but even a talented base start could not eliminate the gap between himself and a direct bloodline, and then he froze in front of him for a while. Then the guy turned around and asked if anyone else wanted to fight. The instructor thought that if he was already so strong at the time of his 15th birthday, then he was literally a monster. Then he turned around and said that it was better to hurry up and accompany a friend to the medical center. Another student said that he understood everything, and leaving the man looked at them and thought that if he did not do anything about it, the order of control here would get, despite how amazing it can be, still puts without any support. It's like a puppet, and we need to take care of taming it. As a result of yesterday's battle, Fian got hit hard. He was forced to stay in the infirmary, because he got hit hard then, and after that, he fell into a coma, just at the moment when he lost consciousness. In connection with this, the protagonist was put on probation for 4 days and forced to study tricks. Finally, he closed the book and thought that it was too simple for a text on tactical theory. Then he remembered his university in the real world and thought that considering that he studied up to graduate school, the written test should not be too difficult. He rolled up his sleeves and thought that cramming all day in the estate is complete boredom, and so he wanted to practice his mastery of technique and combat mana. Suddenly, someone approached him and said that he heard that he caused a lot of trouble on the training fields of the 3rd level. The young man immediately looked up and looked who was there. Opposite was the instructor Todd, and the guy immediately asked what brought him here. He replied that the Duke wanted to meet him. The main character immediately came closer and asked why he needed it, and the man replied that they could find out on the spot. They had to go. The question immediately came up, are they really going to go like that? And the instructor turned around and replied that he did not expect him to know the etiquette of aristocrats, so everything would be fine as long as he had good manners. The young man thought that the Duke, even in the novel, did not like all those aristocratic etiquettes, so he thought about it and agreed. After which they went in a carriage through the forest. Inside they discussed that rumors about him were simply everywhere, that the first and second level training was incredible, and Anusha replied that he also did not expect it to be so easy, after which the man looked at him and said that he thought that he was a smart boy. I am sure the others understand this too, and the main character asked what this was for. Then the instructor lowered his head and said that wasn't this his plan to get the Duke's attention from the very beginning. Of course, the guy scratched his head and said that he would not risk his reputation so much just for his attention. If he wanted to attract his attention, he would simply become a very strong warrior. This time, the instructor believed him and thought that he was right. It would be better than what he ended up doing. So he said that the Duke was informed about what happened yesterday and therefore became interested in it. The guy looked out the window and replied that he believed that the battle of one of them was something worthy of attention, and when their chariot drove into the estate, in response he heard that he had defeated someone who was equal in strength to a normal warrior, soaked him into mush, then added that they had almost arrived at the Duke's training fields. There was no need to stand out too much. The guy agreed. Finally, they went inside. There were many men around who were fighting each other. The brown-haired woman saw one of them and thought that this man was the Duke, and indeed, there stood a healthy pumped-up man, filled with energy. He had an all-consuming aura of power around him, and he looked like a muscular giant. Multiple warriors attacked him at once, but they all could not break through his protective barriers. Finally, the defense cracked and the man looked up. Then he looked at them and said that this was enough, they needed to stop, after which he raised some kind of ball in his hands. A second later, it began to absorb all the energy around it, and then it grew to incredible sizes. The young man looked at it and realized what kind of skill it was. Then he looked at the Duke and thought that this was an enhanced skill that absorbs both magical and physical attacks and turns them into a shockwave that you direct at your opponent. The same shockwave flew to the side, and it moved at incredible speed straight to the wall, and a moment later, this wall was destroyed. The guy grabbed his head and thought that this was a mirror of God's battle. He believes that at the moment it is still in the process of development. Meanwhile, the Duke turned in that direction and said that the effectiveness is still lame, and the young man thought that it is not yet complete but already so powerful, it is surprising. After which the blonde turned around and said that the others were making him wait. Then the student and instructor bowed and greeted him. And the Duke came closer and said that he called them here to avoid dealing with etiquette, so they should rise. Then he came closer to the guy and said that he heard that he did interesting things on his training fields, and the boy thought that although he was not trying to impress him, he was still so impressive. Then they grabbed him by the chin and asked who his mother was. The young man answered that her name was Reina. The man replied that he remembered her, and apparently took more from her than from him. He also asked if he had undergone his awakening of the new blood this year. The guy answered yes. Then the Duke lowered his head and said that he heard that he overcame the impulse with the help of only body enhancement, so he wanted to see how strong he was. Then he called one of his soldiers, who bowed behind him and listened attentively. The Duke told him that he wanted him to have a sparring match with him. The blonde asked in surprise if he really needed to do this with this brat. And the Duke stepped forward and said that this was his son, who had arrived here a couple of days ago from outside, so he just wanted to see how strong he was, so he shouldn't push too hard. His subordinate agreed. The young man looked at him and immediately realized that this was one of the 10 people who had previously trained with the Duke, and the man pointed back and said that they needed to go to the sparring field. When they got there were a lot of weapons around. The man said that they could use weapons if they wanted. He would wait until he chose one, and he replied that he didn't need anything. The blonde frowned in surprise and asked if this was true. In response he heard from the main character that he had never been trained in weapons, so he would make do with his fists. Kessner heard this and smiled, saying that it surprised him, and a second later he jumped up and began to attack. Their fight began. The guys looked into each other's eyes. The guy thought that he was fast, as expected from the Duke's confidant. The man then asked if he had dodged without even using mana. That was good. Then he tried to strike again, but the young man blocked it. The man hit him again, and he thought that his opponent was on a different level compared to the guys he had fought before, and from this blow, the guy jumped back. Meanwhile, the blonde approached him and said that he liked his spirit. He doesn't give it his all, even considering that he can corner him, which means he won't hold back anymore. Now the main character was already tense and thought that he was bringing his mana. He must also be one of the Duke's relatives. Then he looked at him and thought that now, thinking about it, he had never fought to the fullest after becoming this character. I also frowned. I thought that since this man was the Duke's confidant, maybe it was worth fighting him at full strength, and began to accumulate energy when I thought that he would stop holding back. A cloud of energy began to appear around him, and the two forces lashed out at each other. The Duke watched from the side and seemed impressed, and the man then looked at the guy in surprise and wondered if this was really the intern's mana. The brown-haired man stood there at that moment and thought that his character had most likely never reached his full potential, because he grew up with the stigma of a bastard who killed his own mother. Everyone abandoned him and left him to live on his own, and because of his guilt, he probably never had the opportunity to use his power correctly. Now the young man grouped himself. He frowned and thought that because of his guilt, he definitely never had the opportunity to use his power. So the guy looked at his opponent and said that he agreed to try anyway, and he was clearly surprised. Then he smiled and agreed, and immediately took off with such speed that he even left marks and shouted that he would teach this kid a lesson. The same man struck him, but surprisingly, the young man was able to block it. Then he looked up and heard that he now understood why His Majesty was so interested in him, so his hearing was not lying. Then he smiled again and said that it was all useless. He struck again, with such force that the boy flew back. When the young man stopped, he thought that he was sure that he blocked the blow. Was this really a skill that doubles the attack? Meanwhile, the opponent was already running towards him. The man was as close as possible and said that he still had a lot to learn and swung again, and the brown-haired man thought that the gap between them was too big, he had to think of something. But before he could do anything, he received a blow right in the stomach. From the force of the blow, he was thrown back right into the wall, and the blonde then smiled and said that he hadn't even started yet, so there was no point in disappointing him. Some more time passed. A silhouette appeared from a cloud of smoke. It was Kessner, who asked what the young man was doing. Was this really all he could do? And the guy raised his head and answered that it was not so. He thought that the gap in strength between them was so great even without using the impulse. Did he need to use the powers of the new blood? Then he tried to get up and thought that then the man would use them in response. This was not an option. Meanwhile, the blonde was getting closer and said that it seemed like he had a lot of thoughts in his head. The guy just wiped the blood and said nothing, and when the opponent pounced on him with a creaking nikami, if he did not start fighting with him at full strength, then he would have to force him. He finally grouped himself and prepared. When the man ran up, he shouted whether the guy finally wanted to fight, then the young man meanwhile raised his fist, and then for some reason hit the ground. The warrior flew back from the blast wave and said that this was great, just what he wanted. The warrior looked up to the guy again, while he was thinking that he did not want to show him everything he was capable of now, but constantly taking blows is annoying, so he needs to hit him at least once. And then he tried to hit him, but surprisingly the man blocked all his attacks. And another fist forward, the blonde bent down and said that this kid had too big a range of attacks, after which he swung himself and added that the young man was talented, no doubt, but his fighting skills were still at the initial level. And then he hit him, but he miraculously blocked the attack. The warrior looked up and said that he had already told him that there was no point in going to the block, and the guy just kept quiet. Soon he said that he predicted that he would do this and tried to strike him back, and the force of the blow was such that the floor began to crack under the warrior's feet. He raised his hand and thought what was going on. How did the young man manage to use a double attack? Then he frowned and thought that he not only shifted the double attack in another one, but also stole his skill, so he blocked it on purpose. These thoughts angered him, and the fact that some kid made the double attack skill his own so quickly. Therefore, he began to accumulate energy and said that of course the young man impressed him. It was becoming much more interesting, after which he came closer and said that from now on, it was necessary to fight at full strength. Then the young man realized that the men were finally using the impulse. Was he really going to demonstrate his powers in all their glory now? But then they were stopped. It was clear that Vaughn was not ready to stop the fight. The Duke intervened and said that this was more than enough, so they had to retreat, after which he came closer and told the young man that his level was impressive, considering that he had awakened with the power of new blood quite recently. In response he heard that he was being rolled over. But there was one thing. The man got angry and said that there was something he would like to check and directed his energy at. The guy was a little surprised when he saw this spherical impulse. Moreover, this blow was directed at him. He stretched out his arms and tried with all his might to restrain it, and while he was restraining himself, he thought that his body would not withstand such a force. Then the old man does not leave him a choice to use the powers of new blood. Then he raised his head and thought that there was another choice, and it was quite possible that he could do it. Because he remembered the fight with Fian and decided that that fight was extremely useful. The fact that the young man was weaker was true, but blocking the impulse with the initial level of body enhancement was almost impossible. And now his eyes practically lit up, and he thought that if he also began to use the impulse, it might work. Therefore, the young man stretched out his hand and began to use his energy, he decided that in this situation he could block the blow. The Duke clearly liked this, but the instructor was shocked and thought that it was impossible. The young man had awakened the powers of the new blood quite recently, and they were already using the impulse. It looked very impressive. The guy raised his hand and thought that the talents of this character were beyond his imagination, so he could only look at how someone uses their skill and immediately copy it. The blonde then approached him and said that as expected from his blood, he copes better than expected, although the main character thought that this is a piece of shit, who considers as part of his lineage only those who are useful to him, and therefore one day he will definitely be able to hit him. Then the Duke came closer and said that he was ready to reward him, since he passed the tests, and asked if there was anything he would like to receive. Of course, he presented gold and said that he can offer money that no one can even dream of, or maybe a mentor for training, anything he can imagine, just let him say. The brown-haired man stood opposite and thought that an unexpectedly good opportunity, but already knows what he should ask for. He presented a crystal and thought that he should collect world fragments before Aiden. This must be done to prevent the destruction of the world. Therefore, he looked at his father and said that he does not need to ask, and the question immediately came, what does he want? The guy raised his head and answered that he wants to test himself in the grave of the god of battles, after which he imagined this grave. There are places like a dungeon, like all dungeons in fantasy, they are full of monsters, but the dungeons of this world are a little different from those in other fantasy worlds, because they are symptoms of otherworldly erosion. And he also thought about the monsters that are there, in other words, they are formed in places where the anomalies of this world and another overlap. Most dungeons intersect with the demon kingdom, and the monsters of this world are mostly also from dungeons. He also imagined the magical power that is there and thought that, however, the grave of the god of battles, in which, according to legend, the god of battles was created, has nothing to do with the overlap on another world. And after which he thought about the crystals, that is where one of the fragments is hidden. The blonde knew this and was clearly angry from what he heard, after which he thought about it, and the young man thought that it was probably too early for such requests. However, the Duke looked at him and asked why he wanted to undergo the trials of the battle god's tomb. The young man came closer and replied that he had heard that it was there that the traces of the battle god remained. He wanted to see the roots of his bloodline, which he felt when he woke up. Kessner was standing nearby and thought that this boy was even more immature than he thought. Then he imagined this place and thought that the battle god's tomb is a place where the coming-of-age ceremony for direct bloodlines is held. His request is like a direct challenge to the entire bloodline. Then he looked at this guy and thought that an illegitimate son cannot get into such a place, but then he heard the Duke agree. The man looked at him and asked in surprise, and he replied that he knew everything, and knew what he wanted to say here, but this was not unprecedented. He also added that there were a couple of cases when strangers went to the dungeon for the sake of an expedition, imagined this situation and said that this simply did not happen in his generation. Then he turned around and asked if the man wanted to go inside. The blonde started shaking and couldn't answer. His thoughts were that he clearly wanted to. The Duke looked at him and thought that he had lived a full life only because he was born illegitimate. He was sure that he wanted to taste the privileges of a direct bloodline. So he looked at the boy again and told him that it was too early for him to go there. He couldn't send a qualified person there, so he would give him a chance to pass the trials of the tomb of the god of battles as soon as he became an official warrior. The young man clenched his fist and thought that becoming an official warrior was not that far away. He just needed to be faster than the main character of the novel. So he smiled and agreed, said that he understood everything. Some time passed, the guy and the instructor left there. The blonde looked at him and remembered his name. Suddenly the Duke approached him and asked what he thought. He turned around and asked if this was what the brats were talking about, and he heard that it was, because he had fought him one-on-one. The warrior frowned and said that it seemed like this man was hiding a lot. I'm sure he was trying in every way not to give it his all to fight him. The Duke frowned and said that when he tried to accept the ball impulse, it looked like he was giving it his all. It looked like he was learning the body impulse in the moment. The blonde told him that he knew that there were guys who were learning in the moment. Then he introduced this man and said that the most amazing thing was his mana. He doesn't know how to control his power yet, but his energy level was simply incredible. At that moment, the Duke introduced a woman and said that his mana was comparable to earn his mana, but there was something. The blonde immediately turned around and asked what it was. The Duke replied that nothing. But in fact, he had some thoughts. The man imagined this guy's eyes and thought that there was no desire for anything in them. He thought about the eyes again and decided that all the eyes of his illegitimate sons were full of desire to receive his recognition, and now he stood and thought that this guy looks like his mother. What an interesting character. Some more time passed, the guys were training on the playground. The protagonist stood aside from everyone and just watched. Then he looked around and saw how everyone was sparring. He watched what was happening and thought that he had almost died of boredom over the past 4 days. Now he could finally learn something useful. And then he turned around and heard how the country was told that they heard that they were going to select 5 from the bastard for a test in the tomb of the god of battles. Considering that Mr. Kessner and Viscount Owen were already in the ranks of the 5, there were 3 free places left. There were students standing and talking that, in all likelihood, this was an expedition to analyze the structure of the tomb of the god of battles. Another answered that it was true, because the structure changes after each cleansing, instead of just disappearing. Although this probability reduces the risk for those who are a direct part of the bloodline, the guy immediately imagined that warrior and thought that he also decided to try, he should hurry up and become a warrior sooner. And suddenly someone approached them and asked if everyone was here. One of the students turned around and said that everyone except Fian, and more thought, is this really the instructor? And indeed it was the instructor Daisley, who ordered them to prepare for training as usual. Then he approached the main character and asked if this one was new. He answered that he was. The old man stopped and said that he could not take part in this lesson, since he had just started. He should ask other students to help him catch up after the lesson. The guy was a little surprised and asked, is this man really not going to teach him? If he wants him to ask others for help, then he should at least suggest who would be a good choice. The instructor came closer and angrily said that this man is clearly thick-skinned, since he makes demands on him, after he injured the captain immediately after joining. In response he heard that he has already received the appropriate punishment for this, and it became clear that the captain is entirely to blame. The old man got even angrier and told him to stop contradicting him, calling him an arrogant bastard, and asked who taught him to talk to his elders like that, and the student replied that he had to understand him correctly, not contradict him. This was a completely reasonable request, this was his job as an instructor. After which he received a blow straight from a club. The man threw him back with one hand, then he grabbed his jacket and said that as an instructor he was ordering him to do something. He pulled him towards himself and added that he would now be running in circles around the training fields until the end of the lesson, while maintaining speed, and that he had to listen to the lesson at the same time. Then he smiled and said that the student would be punished if he could not answer his questions after this lesson. Then he pulled him towards himself again and asked if he understood everything. At that moment, the boy could barely contain his energy and thought that a real bastard was in front of him. The instructor then looked at him and thought, is it really possible that the student was now reproducing Mano? That is why he frowned and thought that he dared to look so highly on his authority as an instructor. After which he struck him again, only in the face, and asked if he dared to bare his teeth in front of him and called him a rut. Of course, the guy flew back from the blow but successfully stopped. Then he frowned when he heard that the instructor's authority here was absolute, and when the man approached, he said that he would throw him out of here if he obeyed and asked if he understood him. The young man held his cheek and thought that maybe he should just hit him, but then he turned away and thought that if he caused a conflict here, it could interfere with his military test. He also looked into his eyes and thought that it was better to restrain himself. He needed to get to the grave of the god of battle, so he said that he understood everything. The old man smiled and answered why he was still here. He needed to go running. The brown-haired man frowned again and got angry, but nevertheless, he turned around and ran. The old man then looked after him. He studied the guy from head to toe and thought that he would make sure that the young man paid for insulting him. After what happened, the old man apparently harbored a grudge, especially since he slapped him then, and he continued to punish the main character for every little thing, physically punish. The young man imagined him and thought that this man was united by the power he had. If he thought that someone had even slightly encroached on it, he immediately, unwillingly, punished them verbally and physically. For example, he arranged fights for the guys, but this man punished training, so no one could disobey, and the guys just endured. He was clearly consoled by the fact that he ruled this place, and then at some point the young man once again worked off the punishment, heard what seemed to tell him to maintain speed. He stood on his head, leaning on one hand, and listened to the instructor that he did not obey him. He thought that the man justified cruel treatment and called it training. The boy was barely holding back and thought he understood why the old man was so willing to mock him, since he had reproduced this manna in front of the other students. Meanwhile, the instructor turned around and said that the student was not responding again. Then he left and said that he should stay like this until the end of today's training, and would also punish him if he moved even a little. Finally, the boy raised his head and thought that he was holding on in case the old man could really teach him something valuable, but it seemed like it was time to start real training. That same day, the men were sitting in their room and reasoning. He lowered his head onto his hand and thought that this guy was just an arrogant bastard. Then he frowned and thought that it was unclear how the young man dared to snap back. The punishments he had given him would have destroyed someone's body long ago. But this young man endured until the end, as if in protest, even when they made him hold huge stones in his hands. How some legitimate child without real blood and training became such a monster, it was unclear, after which he could not stand it and punched the wall. And then he stood up and thought that this guy would break very soon. He just needed to force him, and everything would go just the way he wanted. The next day came. The main character announced right on the site that he was going to take a test to become a real warrior. The other students around did not understand what was happening. They said that maybe this guy defeated their captain, but these were too big words. And the instructor frowned and asked again what the young man had just said and was he in his right mind. But the guy stood opposite and replied that of course he understood everything. Then the old man came closer and said that this was some kind of nonsense. He had not even learned everything he needed to know to become a warrior, after which the guy took a step forward and said that it was all because someone neglected his authority as an instructor, and now that he thought about it, he felt uneasy. He came even closer and said that it seemed to him that this one was not very qualified to teach. The old man got very angry and said that this man was out of his mind. He had to stop talking nonsense. Only he here decides who is worthy of passing the military test. Then he shouted that he really thinks he will let him pass the test after everything the guy said. But in response he heard the student smilingly say that he has no right to say such things. Then the brown-haired man came closer and said that he was officially requesting the spirit of the god of battles. The old man heard this and was very surprised, because the spirit of the god of battles is training. It refers to the sacred practice of duels. Like all those who respect strength, they also had barbaric traditions. Whoever is stronger is the truth. That's how they found out who is the main one. The god of battles gives real warriors his blessing, so if he allows the spirit of the god of battles to choose who is right and who is wrong, then he will be on the winning side, and in this case the instructor could lose. So the old man frowned and asked how the student knew about this, and the young man raised his head and said that it does not matter. According to the laws, as a student, can request the spirit of the god of battle from the instructor, and use this right to prove that the man is not qualified to be his instructor. As the classic legend, the god of battle grew up not knowing his true identity. When he was young, he was insulted by those who reveled in their strength and called himself his instructor. However, the man challenged them. He turned into a god and told his descendants the following: those who rule over others without being able to prove their case deserve to die. And the god was very strict in this. For this reason the law allows students to request the spirit of the god of battle from their instructors. And now the young man stood in front of him and thought that the god of battle was also out of his mind, given what he said, but now it is to his advantage. At that moment, the instructor grabbed him by the clothes and told him not to joke with him. The spirit of the god of battle is just a brat who cannot defeat him. After which he raised him higher and said that he was at least 10 years younger to talk about this sacred ritual. But in response, the instructor heard that they should not be mistaken. The guy looked at him very seriously and said that he had no right to reject the request of the spirit of the god, then threw his hand away. Then he turned around and walked back. All the other students were watching what was happening carefully, and the brown-haired man then raised his head and began to accumulate energy. Then he clenched his fists and shouted that the student was requesting the spirit of the god of battles from the third-level instructor. Everyone was shocked when they heard all this. Yes, the old man, frankly, was confused. Then the guy turned around and said that now the choice is up to the instructor, to accept his request or reject it. If they plan to reject it, then he does not trust all these guys as witnesses. So he turned around and added that he will go and tell everyone the truth. The man was shocked and asked did he really think that he would get away with such behavior. And the student turned around and asked did this man still not understand. He looked into his eyes and said that this was his last chance. Then he turned around and added that he did not want to waste even more time on trash like him. At that moment, the instructor was thinking that he didn't understand what kind of energy it was the strength he showed in the battle with Fian not his limit. Then he lowered his head and realized that he couldn't retreat. He also clenched his fist and thought that even if that person was talented, he was still just a brat, even an unofficial warrior. So he frowned and said that he agreed, he would make him regret such behavior. The duel would pass, but the guy interrupted him and said that he would wait for him in an hour, here. Of course, the old man was surprised and asked why the student decides this, and he smiled and replied that the test subject has the right to choose the place and time. Instead they really think that he wouldn't have such knowledge, but it turns out that the old man is cunning. And he added that, as he said, he no longer wants to waste his time on him, thereby angering his opponent even more. Then the guy just turned around and left, at the end saying that if he wants to escape, he won't stop him. For a while, the man stood there and did not understand where a psycho like him even came from. The announcement of the duel request even reached the Duke's estate. Kessner was standing near the window and thought that the student should request the instructor for the spirit of the god of battles. He knew that this was an unusual brat, but I love him so much, when would he have thought about it? After which he smiled, then he turned to his service. A man came up to him and asked if he was called. The blonde turned around and said that he was immediately leaving for the third-level training center, he needed to get ready. Some more time passed, all the students gathered in the square. The main character walked and yawned. When everyone around was discussing that this was the guy who requested the spirit of the god of battles from the instructor, he looked younger than expected. Also opposite was the instructor himself in full gear and heard the students discussing that they did not understand how the instructor rolled to a duel with such a brat. One way or another, for the first time in 5 years you can see such entertainment. Finally the guy approached the enemy and said that it meant he hadn't run away after all. And the old man raised his head and replied that he would save the life of this arrogant kid and make him regret his arrogance. But the young man grinned and replied that it seemed like a dog was yapping somewhere. After which they both exchanged hateful glances. Suddenly someone appeared there and asked if he was really late. He thought it was not the beginning time yet, and it turned out that it was Sir Kessner. No one understood what he was doing here. The brown-haired man turned to him and asked what brought him here. The instructor was shocked at that moment, wondering if this kid really knew him. He knew before that this arrogance did not appear out of nowhere. It turns out this man was covering for him. But the blonde looked at the guy and said that he heard that something interesting was happening. That's why he came, the spirit of the god of battles between the student and the instructor. What was he even thinking about? The protagonist then pointed his finger at the instructor and replied that he still had no choice when the instructor neglected his authority. It seemed that his head was full of rotten thoughts, so he responded accordingly. He tried to object, but the same warrior simply grinned and thought that this guy was very funny. Then he turned around and asked if he was sure of his victory. The old man may have retired, but he still should not be underestimated. In response he heard that he thanked him for his concern, but nevertheless he wanted to win. At that moment, the instructor looked at the guy and said that he was arrogant until the very end and added that he already wanted to hit him, but asked another instructor to be an observer, so he should wait. Suddenly the warrior said that if the instructor was not here yet, he could try on the role of an observer, and this surprised both participants in the duel, but it was clear from his face that he really wanted it.